The dust was the first thing and the last. It settled in the creases of her grief, a fine, red powder that coated the tongue and turned the memory of water into a cruel joke. Elara Vance stood over the carcass of the calf, its life stolen in the blue-gray stillness before dawn. The air, thin and sharp, carried no scent of rain, only the metallic tang of blood and the dry rasp of death. This was the fourth mouth she could no longer feed. The fourth promise of a future bled out into the unforgiving soil of Vance Creek. The beast was a ghost, a rumor-given flesh and fang that haunted the canyons bordering her property. It left behind only silence and meticulously broken bodies. Her husband, Thomas, would have known what to do. He would have read the tracks, understood the predator's mind, and met its violence with a quiet, resolute force of his own. But Thomas was a year gone, claimed by a fever that had burned through him as mercilessly as the sun now burned her land. She was alone, and the land knew it. The vultures circling high above were a patient jury, waiting for the verdict that felt more inevitable with each sunrise. Her gaze drifted from the savaged calf to the horizon, where a plume of dust announced the arrival of men who were not her saviors. Jedediah Sterling rode at their head, his substantial frame overflowing his saddle. He owned the sprawling ranch to the east, and for months his offers to buy her out had grown from neighborly condolences to predatory demands. With him were 24 ranchers and hands from the surrounding territory, a posse of puffed chests and pitying smirks. They reined in before her, their horses kicking up a fresh veil of ochre grit that settled on her black mourning dress. "Another one, Mrs. Vance?" Sterling's voice was slick with false sympathy. "This is no place for a woman on her own. The beast is getting bolder." The men behind him murmured their agreement, a low chorus of judgment. They saw a failing ranch, a woman unequal to the task. They saw acres for the taking. Elara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. She had swallowed their pity, their condescension, their thinly veiled ambition, for months. She had endured their wives' casseroles and their whispered conversations in the general store. But standing here, with the proof of her vulnerability cooling at her feet, something inside her fractured. The despair that had been her constant companion was ignited by a sudden, searing rage. From the edge of her property, near the dilapidated line shack by the dry creek, she saw a figure watching. Caleb, the drifter who had appeared in the spring, a man as silent and weathered as the bluffs themselves. He never spoke, merely did the odd jobs she asked in exchange for flour and salt, then retreated into his solitude. He stood now, a still silhouette against the harsh light, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous intrusion of the other men. Sterling dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched earth. "I'll make you a final offer, Elara. Fair price. Enough to see you settled somewhere softer." The word was an insult. Softer, as if she were a fragile thing to be packed away. All the grief, all the fear, all the lonely, work-worn hours coalesced into a single point of defiance. Her voice, when it came out, did not tremble. It was low and hard, honed by loss. "You want to prove your worth, Mr. Sterling? You and your brave men." She swept a hand towards the canyons, towards the unseen threat. "There's a beast out there killing my stock, bleeding me dry. If you're a real rancher, face that beast. Stop it. Then you can come back and talk to me about what this land is worth." A stunned silence fell over the party. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Sterling's face, usually ruddy with confidence, darkened with indignation. To be challenged so directly, by a widow they had already written off, was an affront to their collective pride. He stared at her, then a slow, arrogant smile spread across his lips. "A challenge, is it? Very well, Mrs. Vance. We'll hunt your ghost for you. Don't you worry your head about it." He swung back into his saddle, a general addressing his troops. "You heard the lady, boys. Let's show her how it's done." They turned their horses, a noisy, confident departure that left Elara standing in a cloud of their dust, her heart hammering a wild rhythm against her ribs. She had thrown down a gauntlet she wasn't sure she could honor. Far off, The silent figure of Caleb turned and walked back toward his shack, leaving her utterly alone with the consequences of her words. The great hunt began as a spectacle of masculine pride. For a week, Sterling and his men thundered across her land, their voices and gunshots echoing through the canyons where only wind and hawk cries should have been. They were a clumsy, disruptive force, trampling fragile grazing grass and leaving gates open. They treated the hunt not as a grim necessity, but as a sport, a holiday from their own chores. Alara watched from her porch, the rocking chair still, her hands idle in her lap. They would return each evening, empty-handed and full of excuses. The cat was too cunning, they said. It knew the terrain like a spirit. Their failures only seemed to bolster their bravado, each man telling a taller tale of a near miss, a fleeting glimpse of the monster. They were hunting a legend, not an animal, and their efforts were theater for her benefit. One afternoon, she found a section of fence near the north pasture broken, the wires snapped by a careless horseman. The next morning it was mended. The wire was stretched tight and true, the post reinforced with stones at its base. She knew, without needing to see him, that it was Caleb's work. She began to notice his quiet industry, a silent current running beneath the noisy chaos of the other men. While they rode out in a pack, he would be reinforcing the chicken coop, his movements economical and precise. While they drank her well water with careless abandon, he cleared rocks from the spring that fed it, deepening the channel. One evening, she found 2 skinned rabbits hanging from a nail on her porch, a stark offering against the weathered wood. There was no note, no announcement. There was only the act itself. Her initial suspicion of the silent man began to dissolve, replaced by a tentative, fragile respect. His was a language of deeds, not boasts. He saw what needed doing and did it, a stark contrast to the ranchers who saw only what they could take. He moved through the world as if he owed it a debt of quiet competence. His silence was not empty, but weighted with observation. Finally, the men gave up. Their enthusiasm waned as the hunt yielded nothing but sweat and frustration. Sterling, his authority diminished with every failed day, approached her one last time. His tone was no longer sympathetic, but sharp with irritation. "The beast is a phantom, Mrs. Vance. Or you're exaggerating the problem. We've wasted enough time here." He named a price for her land, a figure insultingly lower than his first offer. "Take it or be eaten out of house and home. It makes no difference to me." Alara met his gaze. Something had shifted in her over the past week. Seeing their bluster and his quiet effectiveness had clarified the world into 2 types of men. "The offer is not accepted, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. He scoffed, gathered his defeated party, and they rode away for good, leaving behind nothing but broken branches and the lingering scent of their failure. 25 men had tried. 25 men had gone home. That evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, she watched Caleb from her window. He was cleaning a long rifle, his motions methodical, his focus absolute. The next morning, as the first pale light touched the eastern rim of the canyon, she saw him ride out. He was not heading east toward the town, but west into the rugged, broken country where the beast made its home. He rode alone, a single, determined figure on a dun horse. He carried the rifle and a small canvas roll tied behind his saddle. He did not look toward her house. He simply went. The sight sent a strange, unfamiliar pang through her chest. Not quite fear, not quite hope, but a complex mingling of the two. One rode alone. The words echoed the title of a story Thomas used to read to her, a story of a lone lawman facing down a gang of outlaws. Now the story was hers to live. The silence that descended upon Vance Creek was profound. The absence of the other men's noise was a relief, but Caleb's absence was a weight. She was truly alone now, with the beast and the land and the crushing reality of her circumstances. Yet something had been kindled in her. Watching his quiet, solitary purpose had been like holding a mirror up to her own despair. She had been waiting for rain, waiting for ruin, waiting for an end. No more. She spent the day in a flurry of work she had long neglected. She hauled water from the newly cleared spring, her arms aching with the effort. She inventoried her dwindling supplies, rationing them with a grim practicality. She mended the hem of her dress, her stitches small and even, a tiny act of order against a world of chaos. For the first time since Thomas's death, she worked not with the frantic energy of fear, but with the steady rhythm of resolve. She was no longer just the widow of Vance Creek. She was its defender. Days bled into one another. A week passed. There was no sign of Caleb. The hope she had nurtured began to wither. Each night, she bolted the door and listened to the wind, imagining claws on wood. Then it happened. A frantic bleating from the pen behind the house. A sound cut short with horrifying finality. It was her last milking goat. The beast was no longer content with the far canyons. It had come to her door. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her newfound resolve. That night, the sky grew heavy. The air became thick, charged with an oppressive stillness that promised violence. The storm was coming. The storm broke just after midnight, a deluge of wind and water that seemed intent on tearing the world from its foundations. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. Inside, Alara sat at her kitchen table, her husband's rifle laid across it. She hadn't touched it in a year, the cold weight of the steel a reminder of the warmth that was gone. Tonight, its presence was a comfort. A sudden, violent crash from the barn sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. It was not the sound of the wind. It was the splintering of wood. The beast was in the barn. It was cornered by the storm, and it was hungry. Every instinct screamed for her to stay inside, to bolt the door and pray for morning. But she saw the faces of Sterling and his men, imagined their smug satisfaction at her ruin. She thought of Caleb, riding alone into the wilderness for her. She thought of Thomas, and the way he had never once backed down from a fight that was his. Her fear was a living thing, but her pride was now stronger. Clutching the heavy rifle, she unbolted the door and stepped into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair and dress around her. Drenched and shivering, she fought her way toward the barn, the lantern in her other hand swinging wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows. She slid the heavy barn door open just enough to slip inside. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay, livestock, and something else, a feral, musky scent of predator. In the lantern's unsteady light, she saw it. Crouched over the body of a ewe was a cougar of impossible size, a pale, ghost-colored cat with eyes that burned like embers. It was scarred and ancient, its muscles cording beneath its hide as it turned its bloody muzzle toward her. It let out a low, guttural snarl that vibrated through the floorboards and up her bones. For a heart-stopping second, she was frozen, a child in a nightmare. Then she raised the rifle. Her arms trembled, the barrel wavering. The cat gathered itself, its hind legs coiling like powerful springs. It was going to leap. She was going to die. A shot exploded through the roar of the storm. It did not come from her gun. The cougar flinched, a fresh wound blossoming on its shoulder, and a furious scream ripped from its throat. It spun toward the now-open barn door. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the lightning-streaked sky. He was soaked, his face gaunt and pale, a bloody bandage wrapped around his left arm. He held his rifle with his good hand, his expression a mask of grim focus. He had tracked it all the way back. The wounded cat, enraged, ignored him and launched itself at Alara. Time slowed. She saw the claws extend, the maw open, and in that instant her own will took over. She fired. The rifle's kick slammed into her shoulder, but her shot went true. The cat crumpled midair, landing in a heap just feet from where she stood. Silence, save for the storm and their ragged breathing. They spent the rest of the night in the kitchen. The fire in the hearth fought back the storm's chill as she cleaned and stitched the gash on Caleb's arm, a long, deep tear from the beast's claws. The shared ordeal had broken the dam of his silence. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, telling her how he had tracked the cat for days, finally wounding it, only for it to double back toward the easiest meal it knew, her ranch. "It was your land," he said, as if that explained everything. It had no right. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a creed. She met his gaze across the small table, the firelight flickering between them. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. He simply nodded. A new understanding, quiet and profound, settled between them. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The rising sun cast a golden light over the valley. As Alara stepped onto the porch, she saw a rider approaching. It was Sterling. He must have seen the clean sky and come to pick over the bones of her defeat. He drew up, his eyes widening at the sight that greeted him. The massive, dead cougar laid out near the barn, and Caleb, his arm in a clean sling, standing silently beside Alara on the porch. Sterling's jaw worked, but no words came out. Alara looked at him, not with fear or defiance, but with a calm, unassailable ownership. "The property is not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and steady in the morning air. "Not now. Not ever." He stared at her, at the quiet man beside her, at the vanquished beast. He saw not a widow but a rancher. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away. Alara watched him go, then looked out over Vance Creek. The land was still harsh, the future still uncertain, but it was no longer her enemy. It was her home, and she was no longer alone.